Okay, well, thank you for joining us today. The topic of this session is making your facility welcoming, accessible, and inclusive. Our panelists today are Jan Beljan with the American Society of Golf Course Architects. She also owns Jan Beljan Golf Course Design. And I'm Steve Jubb. I'm Executive Director of the National Alliance for Accessible Golf. When we talk about inclusion in the game of golf, one population that oftentimes is overlooked is the 61 million people in our country here that have a disability. And 1 out of 4 in our country, that means 1 out of 4 people in our country have some type of disability. And here you see a couple of examples of people with disabilities. The person on the right screen, the young lady, obviously is a good golfer. You can tell by that swing. And she is one of the top ranked women on the world golf rankings for women, for people with disabilities. Her name is Patty Valero. And so when you have a person come to your facility that has a disability, they may very well be very competitive. And our sport of the game of golf is one that really can accommodate just about anybody, individuals with disability included, as we've seen during the COVID times. Just think of it, of the 61 million people that have a disability, if we as a sport, as an industry, and welcomed just 5% or even 1% of that population that may be wanting to return to the game or maybe new to the game, that's a lot of golfers that we could welcome to the game. When you welcome people to the game that have a disability, there's some language that really you need to be aware of, and it's what's called person first language, as you see on the screen. Whether it's an individual with a disability, somebody with a hearing disability, you always want to emphasize the individual first. And then at the same token, on the other side, there's terms that you really shouldn't be using when you talk about people with disabilities, whether you don't want to be using the word crippled, physically challenged, and especially for those with intellectual disability, you don't want to be using the R word. So somebody wants to come to your facility. Well, they're probably going to go online at your website and try to make a tee time. You need to, as a facility, make sure that your website is ADA compliant. And that means that it needs to be accessible for all types of disabilities, including the one on the right of the screen, which is an individual with a visual disability, and she or he is using a pad below the traditional keyboard that is for Braille. And many times they'll use an audio device to be able to understand what your website is saying. It interprets it into this audio device. So you need to make sure that you're ADA compliant relative to the website. And here's kind of an example from Rocky Point about a notice that you should have on your website about what your accessibility factor is with your website. And one of the things you need to do as a facility, and this includes not just the pro shop staff, the clubhouse staff, but it also includes the maintenance staff as well, is understand the potential needs of these individuals. Make sure that you have accessible routing, and we'll talk about that a little later in this session. But really, you need to be welcoming these people with open arms. And how do you do that? You make sure that you've got parking that's accessible. You need to make sure that the routes are accessible as well. As you can see in the screen, there's a gentleman here with a mobility device, obviously is going to have a challenge getting up these stairs. Generally, there's somewhere in the facility, or should be under ADA, an accessible point to get into the clubhouse. But notice also the two gentlemen that are assisting this person with their golf bag. They're welcoming that person, they're helping them. And that's really what the staff of the club should be doing, whether it's here in the arrival setting or whether it's on golf course as well. And now I'm going to flip it over to my co-panelist, Jan Beljan, to kind of talk about accessibility on the golf course. Jan?
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate the lead in here. And as you had mentioned, this is quite a telling slide for anybody who is a person with a disability and a mobility device. But please understand that the accessible parking spaces and all the accessible routes around the buildings should have been designed by the building architect when the structure was done. The ADA has been around for 30 years, so any new building or any renovations to the building should have included these points for people with disabilities. But onto the golf course for accessibility. Again, it'll be the compliance with the ADA for the infrastructure, the signage, ramps, curbs, all of that. That too is on the building architect. So everything around the clubhouse should be taken care of from an ADA perspective via the building architect. On the golf course itself, probably the most important thing is to know that there is an accessible route. And the route is the key word here. It isn't a path, it's a passage. It's so that it's a minimum width of 48 inches. And you can see the areas that should be accessible if there's a practice green, if there's a practice tee, and if there's a practice bunker. Not every facility has those items. So if you do, then those need to be accessible. Here's a more broad view of a golf course with the range and the parking. And let's start at the clubhouse to see what does need to be an accessible route or golf cart passage that connects each of these. Obviously, from the parking to the clubhouse, a minimum of 36 inches wide, to the driving range and everywhere else, 48 inches. However, if there are handrails, the minimum width should be 60 inches. If there are curbs, especially along the fairways, there should be a curb cut every 75 yards, and these would be a minimum of 60 inches wide. When you're at the practice range, the accessible route, again, should be 48 inches wide, and where there are handrails, 60 inches. The teeing stations should be designed so that when constructed, the mobility device, it allows a golf cart to enter and exit. Where the teeing stations are provided, we should have at least 5% and not less than one teeing station that will accommodate a person with a disability and a mobility device. The teeing grounds, if there are more than two, the most forward tee should be accessible, except where not possible by terrain. But if there are 3 or more teeing grounds, then a minimum of 2 tees need to be accessible, which of course means the golf cart or mobility device needs to be able to drive up onto it. The same thing with putting greens. The design, they should be designed and constructed so the putting green can be accessed by a golf cart, which means if your triplex mower can get there, so can a golf cart. This includes practice putting greens. You'll see that they're on the teeing grounds that they're looking for a 2 club length depth, which of course is in the rules of golf for where you should set your markers anyway. Weather shelters, a minimum of 60 by 90 covered and drivable and at grade. That clear space. And probably the most important question that's asked is, what about bunkers? Well, they're hazards, but that means that they should still be accessible to the point where there's a relatively flat entrance and it's wide. So it's something that's probably a little bit shallower than what your sand pro might use. Firm sand is a key. If you're going to be doing any alterations, this is when the accessibility standards kick in for that particular location, not for the entire property, only for what you're going to be disturbing. And it's really what is technically feasible for the facility. What you touch, you fix to meet the standards for new construction. For compliance for the course accessibility, here's something you can find from the access board through the government, and you'll see a website down below. Remember that post-COVID, that any trash receptacles or water fountains need to be where people with a mobility device can reach them. We talked about golf cars being on the putting greens. Here you can see there's an event, and there are multiple assistive devices on the putting green, and they are not causing any more problems than if you have your triplex on the green. the course is wet and you can't mow, certainly the people who want to play there will understand that if you can't get the greens mower on the green, their carts can't be on the greens either.
Thank you, Jan. When you're working with an individual with disability and welcoming them to the game, attitude is a very powerful tool. They're just individuals that happen to have a disability, but they're individuals. You'd welcome them just as you would anybody else, keeping in mind that they're also a customer. A person with disability, the population with disability in this country has a discretionary income that's about after taxes and necessities of $21 billion. So they definitely are a customer. If you're looking for more resources, the National Alliance for Accessible Golf has a website called accessgolf.org. We have a toolkit under the resource tab that can help you with the things that we're talking about today of making your facility accessible. And here are some resources. The data we had up front about statistics is from the CDC. Here's our website for the National Alliance with our email address. And here's again that access board link as well. And we want to thank you today for joining us. Jan, thanks for being on the panel, and you all have a great day.